Robert Redford never asked the world to love him, and that, perhaps more than anything else, is why it did. He didn't chase the spotlight with the hunger most young men carry into Hollywood. He walked into it slowly, almost reluctantly, like a man who suspected that fame would cost him something he couldn't name yet. And he was right. Because what fame eventually took from him, and what it gave him in return, wasn't written in any screenplay. It was written in the faces of the women who loved him, who left him, who shaped him quietly into the man the world thought it already understood. Most people who think of Robert Redford see the jawline, the blue eyes, the effortless cool of the Sundance Kid. They see the Oscars, the magazine covers, the kind of career that seems to unfold like destiny on a silver screen. But those images, beautiful as they are just the surface. Underneath lived a man who lost a child, who watched marriages crumble under the weight of ambition, who fell into passions that burned too hot to hold, and who spent decades quietly searching for something that had nothing to do with fame. He found it, eventually, but the road to finding it carved him open more than once. This is not a story about Hollywood gossip. It's not a list of conquests or a catalog of heartbreaks dressed up as entertainment. This is the story of how a man becomes who he truly is, not through the roles he plays on screen, but through the loves he carries, the losses he survives, and the rare, quiet moments where life finally stops demanding something from him and simply lets him breathe. 6 women. 6 chapters in a life that looked golden from the outside but was far more complicated, far more human from within. Each of them touched something different in him. Each left a mark that even decades couldn't erase. And understanding them means understanding Robert Redford in a way that no biography, no interview, no documentary has ever quite managed. So forget the legend for a moment. Forget the Sundance Kid and the Golden Boy and the Hollywood icon. What's left when you strip all that away is something richer and far more worth knowing. Lola Van Wagenen came into his life before any of it mattered, before the fame, before the critical acclaim, before the world had any opinion about Robert Redford at all. She married a young man with ambition and very little else in 1958, and what that required of her, the faith, the patience, the willingness to believe in someone the world hadn't discovered yet, was not a small thing. Lola was a historian by nature and by profession, someone who understood that meaning lives in context, that you cannot judge a chapter without knowing what came before it. That kind of grounding was exactly what a young man chasing an uncertain dream needed beside him. She didn't glamorize his ambitions or feed his ego. She steadied him, and there is a profound difference between those two things, especially in Hollywood, where flattery is currency and honesty is rare. They built a real life together. 4 children, a home, a routine that had nothing to do with red carpets or flashbulbs, and for years, even as his name grew larger and the demands on his time multiplied, that life held. But fame is a patient and persistent force. It doesn't always destroy things dramatically. Sometimes it just stretches them, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you realize the distance between 2 people has become too wide to cross comfortably. By 1985, after 27 years, their marriage ended. There was no scandal, no public war. Just the quiet, painful acknowledgement that 2 people who had once been everything to each other had grown into different shapes, and the spaces between those shapes could no longer be filled. Redford spoke of Lola in later years with a tenderness that was unmistakable, not the tenderness of nostalgia exactly, but of genuine respect, of recognizing that someone gave you something irreplaceable and that you carry it with you even after the relationship itself is gone. She was his foundation, and foundations don't disappear when the building changes. They stay buried beneath everything that follows, quietly holding the weight of all that came after. Natalie Wood was something else entirely. She arrived in Redford's life during Hollywood's most intoxicating era, the 1960s. when the studios still controlled everything and the myth of the movie star was at its most powerful. Natalie, from childhood, had been constructed and consumed by that myth. She was one of the most extraordinary women to ever appear on a cinema screen, not just beautiful, though she was extraordinarily so, but luminous in that specific way that suggests a person is burning from the inside. They worked together on Inside Daisy Clover in 1965, and then again on This Property is Condemned in 1966. On screen, their dynamic was electric in ways that are difficult to explain technically. It had to do with tension, the kind that builds between two people when something real exists beneath the professional surface. Audiences felt it instinctively, the way you feel a storm approaching before the clouds arrive. What exactly existed between them off-screen has never been fully confirmed, and perhaps that ambiguity is part of what made it matter. Redford was private in ways that Natalie, who had been public property since childhood, may have found both frustrating and magnetic. He wasn't performing for anyone. He wasn't hungry for her the way Hollywood men often were, hungry for what proximity to her could give them. The status, the attention, the association with her particular kind of light. Redford just saw her, and maybe that was the rarest gift she could have received. Friends who knew both of them during that period spoke of his concern for her, a genuine, protective concern that went beyond the usual co-star affection. He understood perhaps better than most the particular loneliness of someone who lives entirely in public. He was beginning to feel the edges of that loneliness himself. When Natalie died in 1981 under circumstances that have never been fully resolved, it hit Redford deeply. He said very little about it publicly, which for him was always the truest measure of how much something had affected him. The things that moved him most, he guarded most carefully. Speaking about her in the years that followed, his voice always carried something careful in it, as though the memory were fragile and required handling with particular gentleness. She was not, by any conventional definition, the great love of his life. But some connections don't require that label to be profound. Some people simply enter your world and rearrange something in it permanently, and the fact that they're gone doesn't undo the rearrangement. Barbra Streisand was not subtle. And Robert Redford, who had built his entire persona around restraint, perhaps needed someone who was not subtle at all. The Way We Were, released in 1973, remains one of the most emotionally resonant films either of them ever made, not because the script was perfect or the direction was flawless, but because the tension between the two people at its center was real. Streisand, who operated without filters and poured everything she had into every performance, and Redford, who kept his feelings behind a wall so carefully constructed that most people didn't even realize the wall was there. Together, they created something that felt less like acting and more like a document of two fundamentally incompatible people trying desperately to connect. Streisand made no secret of her fascination with him. She described him as the golden boy, and in her voice that phrase carried equal measures of admiration and something close to longing. He was everything the mythology of Hollywood promised: handsome, talented, successful, controlled. For a woman who lived entirely in her own emotional weather system, his steadiness must have been compelling precisely because it was so foreign to her. From Redford's side, the feelings were more guarded, but no less real. He admired her enormously, her talent, her refusal to be diminished, her sheer force of will. But her intensity, the way she demanded full emotional presence from everyone around her, sometimes overwhelmed him. He was a man who needed quiet, the way other people need oxygen. She was a woman who experienced silence as absence. The incompatibility was not about feeling. It was about the very different ways they existed in the world. Their film ended with two people parting because life had taken them to places too far apart to bridge. Life, in their case, seemed to agree with the script, and yet Streisand, even decades later, spoke of what might have been with an honesty that was genuinely moving. not bitterness, just the clear-eyed acknowledgement that some chapters don't end because the love ran out. They end because the people inside them are pulling toward different horizons, and love alone, however real, cannot change the direction a person is built to travel. Sonia Braga arrived like weather, the kind of weather you cannot prepare for regardless of how much experience you have with storms. Braga was, by the late 1980s, one of the most compelling actresses in international cinema. Her work in Dona Flor and Her Two Husbands and Kiss of the Spider-Woman had established her not just as a beauty, but as a force, a woman who understood human desire with an honesty that was almost confrontational. She brought that same honesty into everything she inhabited, including whatever existed between her and Robert Redford. What made their connection so significant was not just the passion of it, though everyone who knew them during that period spoke of that passion as something tangible, something that filled the room. What made it significant was what it revealed about Redford himself, because for the first time in his life the controlled man lost control. Not spectacularly, not in ways that became public scandal, but internally, in the ways that actually matter. Braga didn't ask him to be anything other than what he was. But what she was, vivid, emotionally undefended, fully alive in every moment, reflected something back at him that his carefully managed life had not allowed him to see. She didn't just challenge his composure. She made him question whether composure was always wisdom or sometimes just a very sophisticated form of hiding. Their relationship couldn't sustain its own intensity. That's the nature of fire. It requires fuel, and eventually the fuel runs out, or the space around it simply cannot hold that much heat without something breaking. Redford needed balance. He had always needed balance. Braga thrived in the dynamic, in the emotional turbulence that he found exhausting rather than exhilarating. When it ended, it didn't end neatly. Those kinds of connections never do. But what remained was something Redford spoke of with genuine admiration in later years, a respect for her that was untouched by whatever complications had arisen between them. He called her a force of nature. That phrase, coming from a man as economical with words as Redford, was not a throwaway compliment. It was recognition. Sibylle Szaggars was not what the world would have predicted for Robert Redford. She was a German painter, an artist whose work drew from nature with a directness and beauty that had nothing to do with celebrity or commerce. She was not trying to become famous. She was not interested in what proximity to a Hollywood icon might offer her. She was, simply and genuinely, herself, and that quality, so rare in the world Redford had inhabited for decades, was immediately and profoundly disarming. They came together in the 1990s, during a period when Redford had already begun the transition away from being primarily a movie star and toward something more considered. He had built the Sundance Institute. He was investing his energy in supporting independent voices, in creating space for stories that the mainstream industry wouldn't touch. Their relationship grew in the spaces between obligations, in the mountains of Utah, in the quiet rhythms of a life deliberately constructed away from noise. She painted. He thought. They existed together in a way that required no performance, no maintenance, no negotiation of competing ambitions. After the fire of Sonia Braga and the electric charge of Barbra Streisand and the sweet, complicated weight of everything with Lola, Sibylle offered him something he hadn't known he was searching for. Peace. Not the peace of resignation, not the quiet of a life where nothing important was happening anymore. The peace of two people who understand each other fully enough to share silence without filling it, who have each lived enough to know that stillness is not emptiness, but its own particular form of richness. They married in 2009 in Hamburg, without fanfare and without the machinery of Hollywood publicity, just two people making something official that had already been quietly true for years. At 89, she remains beside him. And then there was Jane Fonda, who was never quite a love story and somehow was always something more important than that. Their first film together, Barefoot in the Park in 1967, introduced audiences to a chemistry so natural, so warm and playful and alive, that people assumed there had to be more to the story. The decades that followed, The Electric Horseman in 1979, and finally Our Souls at Night in 2017, only deepened that assumption because every time they appeared together, something genuine and undeniable happened between them on screen that felt less like performance than revelation. But they were never lovers, not in the conventional sense. What they were was something harder to name, and in many ways, more lasting. Two people who understood each other at a depth that romantic involvement might actually have complicated or diminished. Fonda admired Redford's privacy in ways that came from genuine respect for a quality she recognized as hard-won. Redford admired her courage, the way she used her visibility as a platform for things that mattered, the way she refused to let fame make her comfortable when the world around her was anything but. She once said, with her characteristic directness, that she sometimes wished they'd been more.